of you who came for that, but also think about going forward as we try to bring out from what we've heard here into the culture. I want to just raise a few of the controversial topics or the challenging topics that we need to think about as we move forward. And so the first one, for me, in our particular context, is that we want to help people as quickly as possible. There's so much suffering, there's so much that we can do with psychedelics, and it's been a challenge to raise the money all through donations. And so because the political situation has been changed and that there's kind of an open door through the regulatory systems now, and there's a lot of positive support in the media, we've been approached quite a lot by investors. So I personally have been saying no to investors. I think it's really important that we take MDMA for PTSD through FDA in Europe, through donations rather than investors. But on the other hand, there are people that are suffering, and perhaps if we had investor money, we could make things happen quicker. On the other hand, you get all these perverse incentives when you get investors who want to corral things and create patents and make it more difficult. So I personally support the work of Compass, which is the for-profit company trying to make psilocybin into a medicine. But I think we need USONA as the nonprofit to sort of keep the for-profit in check. So I think how we move forward with investors is a big issue. Right now we're basically saying no to them, at least at the MAPS level. Also, what do we think about as we broaden our support, what about controversial donors? For us, I've addressed that. We've gotten money from Rebecca Mercer, whose family owned Cambridge Analytica. We've gotten money from the Koch family, who've been supportive of what we're doing, and also from George Soros, who's controversial on his own. From a lot of people criticizing him for being on the left wing. So the general approach, I think we'll have more and more people who are interested in participating, and how do we handle that? And my approach so far, just to say this, is that I think if people are interested in collaborating with us on doing the research, but don't have strings attached with what they want us to do, or what they want us to say, or what they don't want us to say, then I think it's appropriate. And I think some of the opportunities, some of the donors have been concerned about this whole intersection between science and politics. And so, I've been encouraged in some places to stop talking about the long-term goals being beyond medicine, beyond religion, into drug legalization and license legalization. So those kind of strings I've also rejected. So I think if we can get money from wherever it is, and if we can do good with it, that's my approach. But I think that's something really to think about. What about working with repressive governments? We've been approached by one of our donors who's very interested in having us bring MDMA to China. I've been to China, so has Amy Emerson, the leader of our benefit corporation. We went with the Israeli principal investigator, who was the chief psychiatrist for the Israeli Defense Forces, and we're bringing now 8 to 10 therapists from China to our training from in October. So China is a repressive government. They're very much authoritarian, and so how do we think about bringing MDMA therapy to these countries? My approach on that has been to think about how could it be misused? In what ways? Could MDMA be misused for mind control? Could it be used for interrogations, things like that? And if so, those are already out there. That those militaries of the world know all about that. But the biggest danger that I see, I wouldn't say danger, but just the fact that China appropriates all intellectual property. And so what if we start research in China and they take it away and nothing ever comes back to MAPS? It just seems to me that the more people in China that are not motivated by trauma, the better off. So that's just, one thought. But again, that's something that we're keeping in mind. How do you, think about which kind of countries? Right now, Russia is all shut down for psychedelic research because they're so authoritarian, but maybe that would change if we would have opportunities in Russia. So should we go forward with that or not? what about working with the Department of Defense? I mean, we've been trying for such a long time to get the Veterans Administration involved with psychedelics, and it looks like Rachel Yehuda, who spoke here yesterday, is on the verge of getting approval in the Bronx VA to do MDMA research that we would fund inside the VA system with veterans. But in general, I think we should be moving towards treating people closer to the trauma, not let it, and this means both moving more towards adolescents and young people who are traumatized, not just, right now we can only work with 18-year-olds or above with no upper limit, but eventually we want to be moving towards adolescents and even potentially younger people who are traumatized. So what about working with active duty soldiers who end up potentially being healed from trauma and going back into the battle? Is that immoral? Is that unethical? Or is that something healing? And it doesn't apply just to psychedelics. Every new medical technology is used by the military. So are we against all new medical advances? Are we against the military? And I think there needs to be a distinction between the people in the military and the politicians that allocate and prioritize what the military is going to do. So I think, one of the statements is, love the soldier, hate the war. I think we need to really be willing, and in our view, we are willing to move deeper and deeper into the military system, actually try to heal people from their PTSD shortly after they're traumatized. And I think that chances are people will be more humane in what they do. And I also believe that if it weren't for the military, particularly in the past, in World War II, my Jewish family would have been wiped out if the Nazis would have taken over the world. So I think that, or even if the Russians would have taken over the world, or even if Trump allies with the Russians and creates authoritarian, we need to be wary, and we need, it's still a militaristic world. And so I think there's something very honorable, people who are willing to put aside their personal interests in their lives to fight for the collective. So at least I've answered that question, that I think it's fine for us to work with active duty soldiers, even if they return to duty. And we should be, again, focusing politically on what they're asked to do rather than helping them heal from their trauma. But that's a fairly controversial issue as well. I think in terms of the dangers, and I think as we go out and talk into the world about what you've learned here and all, one of the biggest dangers is overstating the benefits and understating the risks. So I'll just say, David, when you talked about the Good Friday experiment, one person did have a bummer of an experience, and he was tranquilized by Timothy Leary and Houston Smith, given Thorazine, and they never talked about it at all. And when I called him for the follow-up, he said if I ever talked to him or called him again, he would sue me. So, but he was married, had a family, and was a minister. So his life hadn't gone downhill, but he had a very difficult experience during the Good Friday experiment. So that's just one example of how we need to be very, very careful not to overstate the benefits, because then we'll be attacked for that, or understate the risks. And so if we can do that, I think we're really going to build trust in society, build trust with the media, and we'll be able to move forward. I think the other more important thing, or even, is who do we think we are? Are we counterculture? Is this Burning Man rebels? Or are we actually part of a larger culture that we want to then expand the larger culture into opening to psychedelics, opening to these kind of religious, spiritual experiences? So I think that's a big issue for each of us to address. And I've sort of grown up, I think, in a very, I would say, mainstream family that was very interested in blending in, and that I grew up wanting that. And so I don't really want to be a counterculture, drug-using criminal. I want to be a legal, mainstream drug user. And so I think if we can just each of us ask for ourselves, where are we going? Are we going towards, we're rebels to undermine society, or we're trying to go into the heart of the system and embed us? And I'd say one of the best examples for that, and I want to really thank David and Mia and others, is this idea of the Catharsis on the wall. So for those of you that don't know, we brought Burning Man to the Washington, D.C. Mall. So the sacred space of Burning Man in a way is between center camp and the man and the temple. And if you think about the sacred space of America, it's the National Mall, the Washington Monument, and the Capitol. And so it was a big mission of ours to try to work together with the DC burner community to bring Burning Man and have all-night dance parties till sunrise on the Washington Mall. And of course, you can't just have a party on the mall, you have to protest. So it was catharsis for healing, for trauma. But it's that kind of coming together of our worlds that we really need to see more of.
It's free.
And it's free. That's great. It's completely free. Might even be one of the only free Burning Man regionals. Another big challenge for us is how to keep the media positive. So we've been incredibly fortunate over the last 10, 15 years to have virtually no negative stories. And even now, people that are taking psilocybin or taking LSD and then committing violent acts, even murdering people, which are some horror stories that are actually happening, or people dying at raves, that's still happening, but it's not blown up by the media as all that's happening because we have the research and the science, which is sort of the dominant story. So how do we keep that going? And I think one of the main reasons that we can keep that going is to bring patients forward and have them tell their stories, because people will respond to that. So that's going to be another challenge. We've added a new woman to the board of directors of MAPS. She's led two of the largest nonprofit pharmaceutical companies, One World Health and Medicines 360, Drugs for Africa, low-cost pharmaceuticals. She's got over probably $200 million in donations from Gates and Buffett. And she wants to help us make ayahuasca into a medicine. And she's also interested in working with us on ibogaine. So what are these issues of cultural appropriation? How do we take something from a culture that has used it for a long time, is still using it, but then take it and transform it and use it in a different cultural context? Is that appropriate? And I personally think that it is. I think these drugs are tools. They're owned by humanity, you could say, not just particular people that discovered them, but how do we move forward to take tools that are primarily used in religious context and take them into more Western scientific therapeutic context and honor where they came from, but at the same time change them to make them culturally appropriate. So I think that's going to be a big issue as we move forward with ayahuasca and ibogaine. And then one of our issues is going to be for us, it's also going to be for USONA and Compass, it's going to be this whole question of post-approval pricing. So the real question is, what does it mean to have a MAPS public benefit corp? How do you define the public benefit? And how do you operationalize that? And so when you go to the B Corp people, they have criteria for B Corps, but none of them apply to the pharmaceutical industry. So we've had to make up our own. And so we're trying to evaluate ourselves. But the real issues will come, where do we set the price in MDMA? How do we set the price for the training? How do we really provide equitable access? How do we train enough African American therapists? There's a lot of different ways that we're going to try to focus on the public benefit, but I think that's going to be the real challenge, because we're trying to create a whole different model for pharmaceutical drug development that doesn't end up with profit maximization, but it ends up with social benefit. But how do we actually do that? I think that's going to be our main challenge going forward, to operationalize that. And I think that there's other controversial issues. I'd be interested if anybody wants to raise any other controversial issues that we haven't thought about, challenges as we go forward, or things that we should be thinking about, because you've got David and Mia and myself and others that are here. And so if you have other issues, topics that we should keep in mind, I'd appreciate hearing about them.
So one thing that it's not necessarily a controversial issue, but as I've gone through different fields of advocacy, whether it was environmentalism or agriculture, or the recent formation of the High Sierra Psychedelic Society in the Reno Tahoe area, I was a corporate banker in my 18 to 25 years, and I love psychology. And what I see is that we have a population of people that's a relatively small population that essentially make the world go round. And when I was talking to Tim Chang a few months ago, I asked him, are we intentionally targeting the 1% and trying to cultivate experiences that are psychedelic if we know this creates empathy, and if we know this population is essentially what's creating the demise of the rest of the world? And he said that fortunately for things like Burning Man, that some of that is happening and there is some intentional cultivation. But is there any thoughts more of like, really targeting a population and having a top-down effect?
Well, I think first off that there are those efforts going in all sorts of different ways. There's actually some of the people that I can't talk too much about, but that worked in Washington, D.C. There's ayahuasca circles outside of D.C., and there's been Senate aides, House aides, some members of Congress going to have these kind of experiences, which unfortunately they can't really talk about in a public way. So I think there are those efforts, very intensively and intentionally going on. But at the same time, we need to really keep in mind that it's got to be directed towards mass mental health, but that the change makers at the top often do determine what shows up in the media. So for example, with Rebecca Mercer, it's not that she's had these psychedelic experiences, but she was very supportive of helping veterans, and because of that, we've got positive coverage on Fox News and Breitbart and all these other ways. So the idea of influencers having a big impact is really right. But again, it has to be done in a very delicate way. So yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Rick. That was an incredible download and update. That was awesome. And I loved also hearing about the cultural context and bringing some of these medicines like ayahuasca and ibogaine being synthesized into our own culture. And as someone who has deep relationships with indigenous elders in the Bwiti tradition in Africa, they want to simply be in the conversation. And I'm not sure if you're aware of some of the scientific research on the music and what it does to the brain and some other elements of ceremony, like how it regulates the heart. To be in a respectful council, to be listening and in dialogue. And I would love to see more bridges of communication between the scientific world and the indigenous teachers of just openness and sharing, because they're not here to impose any ideas, and we even say that their tradition is not a religion, but a study of life that is infinite. And they want to join the party. And I'd love to see more councils like that. Thank you.
Here. Awesome.
That'd be great. Yeah. In the same vein, though, I'm really grateful many times that MDMA does not have a cultural history, or that it's synthetic from the lab, so that we can then create it fresh without, trying to, have people think that we're, stepping on their toes or ignoring what they do. But I think going back to the people that have used this for thousands of years, the one thing I will say is that, again, there's power dynamics, so that these are not always the ideal models. The shaman is the powerful man. You've heard Tom and Sri talk about how this is about helping people heal themselves. So there is a different power differential. So there's things that I think the indigenous could learn from us. There's stuff we can learn from them.